Okay. So. Baruchim habaim, welcome. Welcome to Awakening Torat Mussar Mindfulness, our weekly podcast, vlog, where we have a public offering of looking at the weekly Torah portion from the lens of Mussar Mindfulness, the beautiful dialogue and combination of these two ancient traditions of Mussar in the Jewish tradition and mindfulness out of Theravada Buddhism of the Dharma. We also look at, of course, this year as a gift to ourselves, how we acquire Torah according to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, anywhere between 48 and 51 different ways of acquiring Torah. It's a bit like the Eightfold Path, but with 48 and 51 to 51 different ways of doing so. And we also look at the specific Mussar practices that can be cultivated and developed along the path in order to strengthen one's practice. And of course, the goal, the wish, the kavanah, the intention this year is to really look at what we think the master middah, if we can narrow it down to one, of the soul trait, the personality trait behind the weekly Torah portion, which of course is like almost an impossible task, right? Because we have so many different ancestors in the Torah portion that each have their own path, their own struggles, their own successes. So we do the best with what's been given to us. Today is Monday, December 6th, here in Haaretz, in Israel, in my ancestral land. It is now about 2:22 p.m. at night. If you're welcoming us more on the west side of the world, in the US, Canada, and South America, it is earlier in the day. And if you're joining us, of course, all the way over on the eastern side of some of the Southeast Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand, and such, it is actually well into Tuesday, the 17th. And if you're joining us anywhere along the mid here where Israel is, then you are late at night with me here. Today is the 15th of Kislev, the Hebrew month of Kislev of Tafshin Pei, the Hebrew year of 5785. I am delighted that you have joined us. I am Rabbi Chasya Uriel Steinbauer, the founder and director of Hamakon LeKedusha, the Institute for Holiness, Kehilat Mussar Mindfulness. We are a community of practitioners on this path of a lifetime. And I'm delighted that we're here together. Of course, we try to meet together on Motzei Shabbat, right after the Sabbath here in Israel, to cover that Torah portion of that week. So obviously this week it is VAYISHLACH, which we just covered this past Shabbat. This is going to be our 8th sitting of the year. The 8th Torah portion coming out of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit. So with all that in mind, if you haven't heard the Torah portion or read it or studied it with any of the classic commentators, you'll want to turn to Genesis chapter 32, verse 4, through chapter 36, verse 43. And I'm going to suggest that something that most people, normally I put out to, for instance, on our podcast of this, if you're not joining us live streaming right now, you're listening later on your favorite medium for podcasts, we put in a poll, for instance, and I think it's in I can't remember the name of the company of the podcast. Trying to remember. I'm losing it right now. But basically, we could put in a poll of what you, as our audience, think is the master middah. And often I'll get responses. They're usually very much the same every week almost, whether it is patience, savlanut, or it's bitachon, trust in God, or emunah, faith. Sometimes you'll get anava, humility. But I'm going to suggest maybe something a little radical, which is that it's simcha, it's joy. Now, when I say joy in English, it is not the same thing as happiness, which we will delve into. What does that mean? The difference, of course, from a Jewish perspective. But first, I'm going to, of course, give a summary of this Torah portion for those of you who haven't studied yet, may not know what VAYISHLACH is about. Hopefully, you've been following along this whole year. So you've been following the stories of our patriarchs and matriarchs. So we move from Abraham to essentially Yitzhak, his son, and then, of course, to his sons, Yaakov and Esav. And we are in the midst, essentially, of this story of the patriarch Yaakov, known as Jacob in English. Okay, so he, just to remind you, had to flee, even though the language is that he walked. He was 17 years old when he decides to, based on his mother's bidding, to leave his homeland with his family in Be'er-Sheva and in the land of Canaan. And because Esav, his brother, is so enraged at him, his twin brother, for stealing essentially his birthright, for doing it through deception, and also his blessing, that he has to flee to, and his mother, Rivka, has told him to flee to Lavan, her brother, back up where she came from, back up in Mesopotamia. So we have this 17-year-old who, in last week's Torah portion, who it's his story of traveling up there, traveling north, and encountering God and angels on a ladder, and encountering the love of his life and entering the family of Lavan. And so now what we're encountering in VAYISHLACH, as you can almost gather from the name, that in the sense that he is sending out both himself and messengers, because he's now an adult. He's 37, 20 years later, and he is ready to leave Lavan and head back home. Now, the summary is that Yaakov sends messengers to his brother Esav, the one that he had lied to, deceived, hurt very badly, and they haven't spoken in 20 years. So he sends messengers to him saying, Yaakov and his family are returning to Eretz Canaan. Now, with that message, Esav decides to come and greet him, and he comes with 400 men. Now, when we read this as moderns, we immediately think, and even our ancestors through the rabbinic commentary, most assume that when someone's traveling with 400 men, they're coming with hostility, they're coming to fight, they're coming to cause harm and suffering. However, if you do look at some of the more scholarly work of anthropologists and historians, they said it was quite normal for someone like Esav, who is essentially a patriarch of 12, almost what you want to call them 12 tribes, 12 princes, who will end up being their own peoples and descended from this. He's part of Adom and Seir. He's created a whole family unit and a people. And for someone to travel like that in the area of Canaan and even heading towards Mesopotamia, it is normal to travel with such a large group of men, perhaps to protect the patriarch. Who knows? But so either way, when Yaakov hears that Esav is coming to greet him with 400 men, he becomes petrified, absolutely petrified. But instead of allowing that to move into the type of trauma response of freezing and not being able to pivot and know how to respond, Yaakov does four really key things in order to metabolize the fear, and also to do what is in his own power to do. And then the rest is up to God and Esav. So he gathers intelligence. How does he do this? He sends out droves of messengers with animals. We'll get to that next. That essentially meet Esav along the way, and he's able to gather information about, when is he coming, how many people is he coming with. Yaakov begins to scout out the land that he's actually in, and decides what's best to respond to this. He splits his own family camp, one, half the family over here, half the family over here, in order to, with hope, that if Esav did come with intention to cause harm and suffering, to hurt Yaakov and his family, that he's hoping that at least one set of the family, by splitting the camp, will survive, will be able to run away and survive. This might be wishful thinking, but we don't know. The third thing is that he prays. He turns to the Almighty and says, "You've protected me all along. You've been with me. Please protect me now from my brother Esav," right? Which is interesting because it makes me think, if you follow this story, that Esav over the past 20 years is probably saying similar words to God. Please protect me from my brother Yaakov. Do not let me see him again. Do not let him deceive me again. Do not let him cause me harm and suffering. Here he comes, he's returning. He thinks, who knows what he is turning to God and saying. The last thing Yaakov does is he sends gifts, first called mincha, but eventually it turns into a bracha, which we'll touch what that means, blessing, but it means something much more stronger. He sends over 550 animals to Esav as a way of placating him, of buying him, of calming any anger or rage that might be there. Peace offering, if you'd like to call it that. So that's his method. Essentially, what we saw at the end of last week's Parasha is Yaakov, in his adulthood now, 20 years later, is learning that he can no longer continue to run away from people. That was his MO, his modus operandi, when his mother at age 17, you need to flee to my brother, or you're going to be killed by Esav. So when he fled Lavan, he didn't tell Lavan he was leaving. Lavan took it as that he was fleeing and running away and essentially kidnapping his daughters and the grandchildren. So Lavan catches up to him, and they have, of course, their encounter, and are able to have some form of reconciliation and also departure, right? Disengagement. So this is the same thing now, is that Yaakov is learning he can't really run from Esav, even though it's 20 years on the run. The train is coming in. So one of the key things I want to talk about with acquiring Torah, the eighth way of acquiring Torah is joy, is simcha. Now, in order to understand how you acquire Torah through joy, is that you are living a certain way. You are living a way that is upright, in alignment with what is expected of you among the rule of law and the laws, the commandments. You are someone who lives with integrity. And the idea is that when someone lives in alignment with their values and basically their inside, what's going on inside with their thoughts and heart, reflect their deeds on the outside, and the deeds reflect what's inside, what we call integrity. Someone lives with a deep joy, joy meaning at one with oneself, right? And an at oneness, centeredness. It's quite a gift. It's quite a beautiful thing. And the idea, of course, in acquiring Torah is that one live in this straight heart, essentially, like we learn from the Psalm 97:11, to go to the straight of heart is joy, right? And this idea that experiencing joy when we are living with this upright heart and behavior, the joy is almost like shefa, abundance, and a gift. It's what comes out of it, right? So being morally and emotionally and ethically upright and behaving in that way is how one acquires Torah as an actual spiritual discipline and a practice, and the eighth way in which we acquire Torah. Now, just to put it succinctly, right? What's the difference from happiness? Just briefly, happiness is ephemeral. Happiness is external. It's things that happen to us that cause a temporary pleasantness. Even embedded in the word happy in English, the root is haphazard, hapless, happenstance. It's this idea of momentary chance, like what we receive, what happens to us, can elicit happiness, right? But orienting one's life to the path and to divine will, right, is completely different from happiness. It's the centered joy, and this is key to our understanding, essentially, of living. The heart dances when it's full of integrity. It just does. There's walking around with a sense that not only am I okay, but I know I'm doing the right thing and believing the right thing. And as I said, there's a deep minuchat hanefesh, a deep equanimity there, that is profoundly part of it, essentially. So what does this have to do with Yaakov, right? So he comes from a family that practices deceit. His mother, what he did at age 17, then what he does later, what he encounters from his uncle Lavan, who is full of deceit, and then he himself, what he does with the sheep, and then running away from Lavan, this constant kind of not living with integrity, right? Where there's this struggle, right? I mean, if we're going to talk about, there's this ta'am of how we learn Torah, the musical notes, sheshelet, that goes up and down and up and down. And the rabbis interpret this as this like push pull, right? Where you are tested completely. And we see this in the development of Yaakov in this Torah portion, where he's someone who's trying to do the right thing. He shows up as this 17-year-old who kisses Rachel, is infatuated, wants to marry her, but doesn't come in really understanding or respecting the rules of the land that you marry the eldest first. So he's essentially lied to. Lavan acts with deception and marries his eldest Leah to him first. And of course, the key statement, when he says, "How could you do this to me? How could you lie and hide, Leah and bury me to Leah with instead of Rachel?" And he says, essentially, Lavan says, you would know. Like, essentially, this is the master of deception, that you lied and hid yourself and pretended you were Esau to your blind, dying father. And this is how deception shows up. It's like this, especially in a beautiful story handed down to us, this idea that of karma, of consequences for our behavior will show up and affect us. So he's of course, he says nothing, right? He's completely silence as in, oh, you're right. Ouch. Right? And so if we look at silence as a middah, like how is it? Is it balanced there? I think it is balanced there, right? Because he needs to start reflecting as a 17-year-old his deception, what he did. So he works for 14 years for both wives, and then an additional 6 years, 20 years laboring and growing, trying to do the right thing, figuring it out, but then engaging in deception again, then running away. And then he finally has to encounter himself as a man to Lavan, face how terrifying it is to be confronted by the patriarch who could have caused you harm with all his men, but he doesn't, commanded by God not to. And so what we witness is there's no joy. There's no joy in Yaakov's life during this struggle, because he is not at one with himself. He's not in alignment with his values. He is someone who lived in deceit. So he has to develop and get on this path of uprightness, right? Of living in alignment with his morals and ethics and values. And so one of the key things in Mussar, which I'll introduce to you briefly, is this idea of a bechira point, translated often as a choice point. So I'll introduce you to someone very important in our Jewish tradition, Mussar teacher, if I can pull up my text here, who actually creates this idea, is the wonderful Eliyahu Eliezer Dessler Harav, passed away in 1953. May his memory be for a blessing. His father learned from the Altar of Kelm, one of the classic 3 Mussar schools. He's the youngest student in the yeshiva of Kelm in 1906 at age 13. He is someone who's deeply entrenched in the Mussar teachings and tradition, and he will develop this idea essentially of what is called nikudata bechira, right? This point of free will, of choice point, that he feels that every person has this one point in service to God where we have to, the language used is battle and fight our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination. But today we would use the language of one has to face and have an awareness of that we all have within us drives and states that arise that are unpleasant, sometimes unethical, immoral, that advise us to engage in that which is not in alignment with our values, that will cause harm and suffering. And so we have to struggle with that, whether it's a voice, a story, a narrative in our head, in the body. And so Rav Dessler thinks that he explains that for others, I mean, there are all sorts of other points for each middah, for each soul traits, but there'll be no struggle, right? And that means those levels according to Rav Dessler, have already been conquered, meaning you've already practiced and encountered whatever it is related to that, you aren't being challenged by it anymore. And so there's no battle of will here, essentially. But when we encounter a nikudat bechira, habechira, it is, we are being either tempted or challenged. So an example, of course, of bechira point, which is really learning from the choices that we make or don't make, is Yaakov obviously it was constantly encountering the bechira point, not wanting to listen to his mother at first, not because he knew it was wrong to lie to his blind, dying father, but because he was worried he was going to his father would find out and curse him instead of blessing him. So he's challenged here, right? This is his bechira point, one that is about emet, about truth and falsehood, honor, humility. All those make up one big package for him. Then when he flees, not taking responsibility and apologizing to his brother and his father, instead he flees and leaving. He never sees his mother again. She will pass away. And these are consequences of his behavior and the struggle, that he's not balanced in these areas. And then, of course, what he'll encounter with Lavan living with him, he'll constantly be challenged of, who he marries, when, what he has to do with regard to that, in order to be as upright as possible without treating Leah too poorly. We're given some insight in the fact that it says God knew that she wasn't loved. That kind of signifies something, that if she's not being loved, then who's not doing the loving? Who's not giving? Which is another Rav Dessler key point, that he felt that perfect love was exclusively on giving. So he chose to love Rachel. And, the constant favoritism of Rachel, and obviously with Yosef, and then later with Binyamin, that had such dire consequences for the rest of the boys in the family, that we will see that train come in the next Torah portion. So this is a constant, sometimes he's not even fighting with what we call the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. He's just doing it. He's not balanced at all. He's just acting it out. And then there are other times where you can see him honestly struggling, of trying to figure out, how can I be of this path and along this line of ancestors, of these patriarchs, and I'm next in line. How am I going to behave as well as I can, as upright as I can? And the biggest struggle that we witness with this, talk about nikudat habechira, right? This point of free will, of choice point, is manifests in his wrestling with his consciousness and with the angel, the man of God, in this Torah portion, where he's so in conflict with what he's done, this deception to father, to brother, to Lavan, to self, that he will not let go of the struggle, of the fight, until he says, bless me, right? Bless me. And what is that bless me really about? Forgive me. Let me receive the bracha, the blessing, the way I was supposed to, the way that comes from free will, with love, that is given to me instead of stolen, instead of done with deception. That's what he's really screaming in that fight, right? And that's what it signifies. So the Fidati, according to my opinion, as well as other commentators. So Rav Dessler brings this idea that each of us will battle with a choice point, a free will point within us, choosing to do what is right and upright and ethical and moral and good versus that which is not. And it gets raised higher throughout our life and along the path as long as we are progressing. And so the blessed thing about this is the choice becomes easier to make in the future with practice, right? With exercising that spiritual muscle. He even felt that the human's task in life is to consistently raise our nikudat habechira, our free will point, our choice point, growing ever greater in the service of God. So that's Rav Dessler that comes to bring us one very important Mussar practice that we see witnessed, of course, in this Torah portion where Yaakov is just at a complete battle with it consistently, right? Where he has to take a real hard look at himself of, greed and ill will and delusion and the agitation and the worry and the fear, like, so all those states that arise, right, are a gift from Hashem that is screaming out. It's like a big siren, right? A big red woo, saying, wow, this is your spiritual curriculum. This is here for you to build your interior world. And so we see him wrestling with this angel all night long in this Torah portion. He gets a new name out of this. He asks for a blessing, and interesting enough, the angel responds with a new name, Yisrael. I'm not sure how much that's a blessing, but that's what comes out of it. And he's also injured. So one of the key things that we want to look at is when we are struggling in our lives like Yaakov and not really this constant like this back and forth, there are going to be key features in our life like Yaakov that show us that we have gone through the journey, that we are changed. A dear friend of mine here in Israel said that she's been struggling since October 7th, 2023, from the genocide in Israel, that she was constantly struggling to be the same person that she was on October 6th, 2023. And it was just recently that she finally realized and faced and accepted that she's not the same person and she's not going to be, that none of us are going to be, that we've been profoundly changed by this experience and these wars and this hatred. And the same thing happens to Yaakov. He gets in this intense wrestling within and out. He is injured in his gid hanasheh, right? This part of the hip that is part of the sciatic nerve. Now, if you've ever had sciatic nerve pain coming from the lumbar 5 or the hip, you know how much pain that is. Basically, Yaakov is disabled in some form after this. He has to limp the rest of his life. We'll get to when he actually encounters Esav, which is coming up in the summary, is that after this wrestling with the angel all night, when the sun rises, who does he see coming? Esav with his 400 men. And he begins to send out his family to greet him. But before he does, he himself will bow full prostration. Now, we used to bow this way as Jews when the temple stood. And most likely not just during Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. He did full prostration all the way down flat, not just standing and bowing halfway. So imagine somebody with this hip that's totally dislocated and in pain, someone who is disabled, fully prostrating 7 times, getting down and getting up. I can't tell you how uncomfortably challenging, uncomfortable that might have been to witness that. Someone getting down and getting back up, getting down and getting back up over and over again. He wanted to show complete submission, complete, please forgive me. And one of the most important moments that quotes comes from Gunther Plaut, a wonderful philosopher. He says, Esav expected to meet the 17-year-old Yaakov, the old Yaakov, right? The hated sibling who had overtaken him with deceit and guile. He was prepared for violence if needed, right? But when he finally sees and encounters his brother, sees him bowing full to the ground and getting back up, and I can't even tell you how difficult, talk about embodied experience, difficult that would be with that sciatic nerve pain, getting up and down like that, coming to you to bow like this, right? Everything is changed. What happens is, what occurs is Esav, and this is Gunther's words, doesn't encounter Yaakov. He encounters Israel. He encounters a changed person. He encounters a new man who is physically showing, I want forgiveness. I want reconciliation. I'm here. It's so profound. It's expressed through a performative full body act. It's not in words. It's him limping towards him, repentant air. There is no deceitful arrogance. There is no, I will feed you after you've been out hunting for many days, starving and about to die. I will feed you once you sell me, give me your birthright. There's none of that. There's none of that at all. Essentially, the essentially simple and uncomplicated Esav, who himself has matured over the 20 years, senses this at once, senses, I am not encountering the 17-year-old Yaakov. And that merits running to him and kissing his newly found brother, Israel. Some of the most beautiful, potent words shared about this moment, because that is when joy happens, because Yaakov has done the work of, oh my God, I'm horrified by my behavior, and I'm probably not worthy of forgiveness, and I know that, and so I'm going to show it as much as I can. I'm also going to give the bracha. I'm going to give 550 animals to say, this was yours all along. This is what you were supposed to receive, the double portion from our Father. I'm giving it. I'm giving it back to you. This is my gift to you. And if you notice, Esav doesn't give back. Esav accepts. He knows exactly what's going on. It's unbelievable what we witness here in this Torah portion, this deep vulnerability. He even says, I was a ger. Yaakov, I stayed with Lavan. He shows his vulnerability. And this is something key that only we can really demonstrate to the world and show as a real ancient people who are still alive in our land and our language and everything, is that even when we were in exile in the diaspora and even had positions of power and wealth, we were always deeply vulnerable before we had our own country and army and in our ancestral land. And so this is what he's demonstrating. I stayed with Lavan, showing like I essentially was an indentured servant. And despite all this wealth, despite that I'm able to give you 550 animals, right? I was deeply vulnerable, right? I was being manipulated and controlled by our uncle. And there's something really profound about all of this experience going on. And so they have this encounter, they kiss, they cry. What a release. I mean, I don't know about you, but I always feel such a release in this Torah portion. Like, may we all have such reconciliation with siblings that we might be at war with or have tension with. So he has to go through this encounter, and with it comes out this deep joy, this deep menochat hanefesh, this equanimity, someone who can see clearly what's before him, and to be able to move and metabolize the guilt and the shame, to be able to know when he should give and show this right, this upright and honest behavior. This reunion and reconciliation. And then what does he do? It's not like a magical thinking, right? He knows they're both very human still. And he knows if he goes and returns with Esav, although he might never be killed, he's going to be subsumed under the people of Seir, of Edom. He will become part of Esav's people, and it'll be gone. The whole line of Yaakov will be gone over a generation or two. He knows that's not his path. So although there's reunion and reconciliation, he knows he can't return with Esav. He's seeing clearly. And he goes ahead and goes a different path. He says, I'll meet up with you. Again, there's a bit of deceit there. It always shows you this, right? This back and forth. He says to Esav, I will meet up with you. I just need to go more slowly. Probably by that point, Esav knows fully well that he won't see him again, only at the funeral of their father. He accepts that, moves on. He even offers some of his men, let my men stay with you, help guide you along the way. And Yaakov says, no, that's okay. We'll make it. We'll move slowly through this and be able to meet up with you, right? I will say, as we always look at even when we've come to profound joy, balanced joy because of our behavior, right? Where his spiritual fuel now, right? The catalyst that internalizes growth is his joy that he has released and been forgiven and let go with Esav, right? Same thing in our own lives. That there are consequences still for our behavior, and that it will arise, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. So what happens? Yaakov decides to not go with Esav, not go with family. Yaakov decides not to have some of Esav's men come with him as a form of protection. And the consequence is he ends up again as a ger, someone vulnerable and foreign, in Shechem, where his daughter Dinah will be kidnapped and raped. Had he gone with Esav, that wouldn't happen. Had he accepted Esav's men, that probably would not have happened. And that is very important. Okay, we need to understand that sometimes, even when we think we're on the right path and doing the right thing, if we isolate too much, try to control too much our path, there sometimes can be dire consequences. So, and of course, we just see like event after event after event, kind of almost signifying that there's something larger and cosmic here, that not only Yaakov's going to have to move through the ring of fire, but everyone in that family. And part of it is because of his behavior of favoritism towards Rachel and those children of Rachel versus the whole family, right? So first we get the death of Devorah, the beautiful nurse to Rachel. Then we get the death of Rachel during childbirth. And then we get Reuven's, essentially it's rape. They don't call it that, but rape of Bilhah, the wife to Yaakov, who was the slave, the servant to Rachel. Rachel has passed. And so Reuven is like usurping power. Like as the eldest son, the eldest child, he is trying to take over the power position of the patriarch, challenge to his father, essentially lies with her. And his way of saying, which is very common in the ancient Near East historically, that sometimes the eldest son would, on the death of the father, take the wives of the father. This is the train coming in of favoritism of Rachel. This is the consequence. Now, I don't mean to say that as in Reuven's not responsible for his own behavior. He is, and he will face that train coming in soon. You will see that. But we can't turn a blind eye to the wheel that is rolling and the behavior that led to this moment. So this idea of ill will and revenge, even though Yaakov has metabolized it and moved through it with Esav, it will be festering and building and among his sons. And who they're really angry at and wish to cause ill will and revenge against is actually Yaakov, which, except for Reuven, they don't feel they have the power and privilege to actually challenge and do. So they take it out on Yosef, which we will see coming next week, the youngest son at the time. So it's an interesting that you see this playing out. Like when Esav gets hurt and receives the harm and suffering, he's sitting with his own ill will and revenge and the state of it and the power of it, his own nikodat habechira, right, where he feels he has no free will, no choice. He wants to act out, and he's planning. He's waiting till the death of the patriarch, till Yitzhak, to do this in his own head. The same thing with Reuven, right? Reuven is plotting and waiting with that ill will and revenge for the death of Rachel, and we don't even know it until afterwards. He's sitting as a teenage child, watching his mother be treated poorly by Yaakov, favored and ignored because of Rachel. Painful for that child to grow up and witness and see. This is it. The train comes rolling in. He also waits until the death of the top matriarch in order to act out. Esav never ends up acting out, thank God, which is incredible and a blessing in some ways, right? So all this is to say that we witness so much of the path and practice here in this Torah portion, right? This back and forth of many of the ancestors being tested by the highest level of the point of free will, the free will choice, the choice point, the nikudat habechira. Even later, with Dinah being kidnapped and her brothers Shimon and Levi deciding to murder all the men and boys of Shechem in response. I mean, these are huge consequences of behavior will come rolling in, right? And then Rachel, as I told you, will die giving birth to Binyamin on the road to Beit Lechem. She's buried there. And Yitzhak, finally at 180 years old, will die. And what happens? Esav and Yaakov will bury him together. And Esav doesn't try to kill him. The reconciliation was really complete. There's no more ill will and revenge being plotted or being acted out. So unfortunately, that's what's brewing in the family of the 11 boys at the time. Sad to say, it's a tragic story coming our way. So all this is to say that the ways of acquiring Torah presented to us in the Mishnah, in this classic ancient rabbinic text, where we really begin to codify how we live out the Torah as instruction, the Hebrew Bible, that these ways presented to us of acquiring Torah, acquiring their instruction, which means really internalizing it, being able to live it. For some of us, it will be through the path of joy. And joy here, simcha, as I said, is really living this upright, moral, ethical way of life where you are so living with integrity, the inside matching the outside. It's a beautiful feeling. It is freeing. There's no living kind of tortured with, what happens with the consciousness when someone's knowing that they have done wrong, caused harm and suffering, or have been deceitful, right? So not all of us need to wrestle with angels. We can be quite balanced in acquiring Torah through simcha, through our upright behavior, which causes a profound sense of menochat nefesh, of equanimity. So with this path of Mussar mindfulness and this 8th sitting together of really looking at VAYISHLACH, we've learned from our ancestors, in particular our patriarch Yaakov, of this push-pull that all of us will have inside of us. It might look completely different from Yaakov, right? Not all of us are going to be dealing with such deceit and causing such harm and suffering, but it shows up in different ways, right? For some of us, it might be savlanut, of bearing the burden, forbearance, patience with others. For some of us, it might be anava, of humility. We might be just profoundly arrogant and taking up too much space with our speech and our energy and our bodies. It manifests in all sorts of ways where we're constantly, habitually being challenged in a certain middah, a certain area. And it becomes obvious to us, especially from what we learned last week. We're keeping a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of the soul journal, looking at our words, thoughts, and deeds over time. We begin to reflect like, oh, I do have a problem here. This is my nikudat habechira, my free will point, my choice point. And we can work on that, B'ezrat Hashem, God willing, by taking refuge in our VAD, in our Mussar group, our Mussar Mindfulness group, where we form community and really are able to work with other practitioners on what's going on and really building our interior world, as Rav Shlomo Walby loved to say, and may his memory be for a blessing. So we're going to conclude, like we always do, with a mindfulness meditation to internalize some of this. So I invite you to assume your posture right now. So classic postures, as you know, come in the forms of sitting. It can be on a zafu, a meditation cushion, or at the edge of your seat. It could be even just sitting on the floor. Standing, often in a strong mountain pose, so that you don't kind of, waver, feel like you're going to fall in the middle of the meditation. Walking meditation just means walking back and forth, going nowhere in particular, right? Because you're just paying attention to what arises. And then finally, lying down, right? Why is that so important? Many of us live with chronic pain, whether it's the back or the sciatic nerve, like Yaakov. God forbid if you had it in the Gid Hanashe and the hip, that would be just so unpleasant. I lived with sciatic nerve after an auto accident, and I ended up having to have spinal surgery, but it took 10 years of conservative treatment before when that boat finally came in. And I know what that pain is like. It's unbelievable. So I know I would not be prostrating 7 times, no matter how much I wanted to show that I was submitting and I was asking for forgiveness. It's just too painful when you have that sciatic nerve. So lie down by all means if you live with discomfort and pain. I advise you to keep the eyes open so that you remain awake and alert for our short meditation. I will ring our bell when it's time to come out of the meditation. And your anchor, which is what you will pay attention to and bring your attention to, it will not only be your breath, but also my voice. But sometimes I will go silent. And so you should pay attention to your breath. Now, for those of you new to mindfulness meditation, you're not here to control your breath. You're not here even to control your thoughts or to make yourself think something else. That's a different meditation, a different path. The path here is just simply to watch what arises in the body, in emotional states, in the thoughts, and to witness them without reactivity, without either trying to change them or fix them, or trying to push them away or be in denial of them. It's simply just to witness and to accept that whatever it is, this too shall pass. Gamze Yavor, right? It will happen. And we build that training of the mind over time. So with that, we want to invite the gift of oxygen in first. And with that gift of inhaling, invite yourself fully here. Mind, body, heart, soul. Inhalation and exhale. I might sneeze in the process. Inhalation. Inhalation, this time raising the shoulders up, and exhale. Such a gift, right? To fill in the whole lungs and the body with air, letting it all out, letting everything rest. Allow your breath to settle to its own natural rhythm. And giving yourself just a short, lovely, mindful body scan, just moving from the top of your head, softening the eyes and the cheeks and the mouth, softening the shoulders, witnessing whatever is here in this process of inviting the breath and softening. The same goes with the upper back and the chest, down into the whole core and into our sit bones. Just observing whatever is here, asking yourself if you can be with it. I think about how many times Yaakov, it was so obvious he couldn't be with what was happening in the present moment, right? Often when we rely on deceit, it's because we can't be with the present moment. So moving down your thighs to your feet, simply whatever is here, inviting a softness, allowing things to relax. This is really a time and a gift to yourself, to each other, to just be, to quiet, to come to stillness. Even if your thoughts are not quiet, for some of us, we may have what we call monkey mind, where the thoughts are just running everywhere. You can just simply observe that. There's no need to try to change it or stop it. Just be like, oh, hello, monkey mind. And for some of us, we might be really quiet and still and really at a sense of peace, that type that comes with simcha, of balanced joy. Noticing any emotional states arising, whether they be unpleasant or pleasant or neutral. What is visiting you today? For some of us, when we read through this Torah portion and studied it can be triggered. The words, especially since we meet them year after year, they can become trapped inside. They're not metabolized. It'd be hard to move the Parsha through our body with us. We can often have a lot of judgment towards an ancestor or towards the Parsha, towards God. So simply just noting if there's any reactivity going on, anything that you want to be different, rather than accepting what is right here and right now. Notice if anything difficult is arising. And asking yourself, can I be with this? Maybe even asking that point inside, what is it that you want from me? How can I comfort you? How can I be present for you? Sometimes it's just the act of being present. That is enough. We often think we have to do so much, like a dramatic act, in order to placate or make something feel better. We're often prone to over response or overreactivity. But it's similar to when you make a Shiva call during the week of mourning. Sometimes the most powerful moments for me this past week and a half when I was sitting Shiva for my Ima, for my mother, may her memory be for a blessing, was when someone could just sit with me, held my hands, put their arm around me, and just cried with me, just was present, didn't try to make me talk, didn't try to stop my crying, my sobbing, my sorrow, just be with me. And that's the greatest gift we can give ourselves during these practices of mindfulness meditation, is being with ourselves. No one can be with us as profoundly as we can be. Nobody can befriend us as profoundly as we can. The path is to become our own best friend. The path is to become that which practices radical self-care, that giving of love to ourselves, so that we can be givers to others and God. That's essentially the whole path that Yaakov attempts to struggle with and do and be, failing miserably along the way, but he still gets up each morning and tries and does again. I think Yaakov, as we will see as we move into the next Torah portion, is one of our most tragic ancestors. We often think it's Yitzhak because he had to bear the burden of the Akedat Yitzhak, where he was bound and almost slaughtered by his father. That certainly had its own trauma and difficulty to deal with the rest of his life. But Yaakov is someone that probably never does learn that profound best friending of himself, the profound self-compassion and radical self-care. Someone who vacillates between silence, shock, and finally kind of vomiting, speaking out with the blessings of his sons later on, to tragically saying at the end of his life that his years have been long and unpleasant, is the best way to put it. Miserable, not full of joy. So as we bring this meditation slowly to a close, it is up to us to learn from Yaakov and our ancestors. What is it that we can do? What could be different in our choice points and how we behave? What can we do differently to begin to practice self-compassion and love ourselves more, to befriend? It's so important to be able to question, how can I pivot? How can I do differently? If you had your eyes closed during the meditation, if you have vision, please slowly open them, allowing the light to filter in. If it is your practice to bow, as it is mine, bow to God, to Hashem, to the Almighty, for bringing us to this moment, for sustaining us. Blessed are you, Hashem. Giving a bow to each other, our Vad Sangha, our community, Kehilat Mussar Mindfulness, that we have this blessing of gathering together and exploring Torah and Mussar and the path of how we can really learn and move forward together. And of course, bowing to our own discipline and practice, the teachings of our ancestors that they entrusted us and passed these down to us so that we may benefit to care for ourselves, care for others, and to serve God. It's quite a blessing. So as we think every week, this week we thank the wonderful father of Max Marcus, who is a student of mine preparing for his bar mitzvah. And Max's father donated in loving memory of my Ima and supporting awakening this public offering. And so we are so grateful to the Marcus family for their donation to sustain us, to be able to move forward with this week by week. So thank you. You too can also donate in honor of somebody or in loving memory of someone. Or just reach out to me at Rabbi Chasya at kehilatmussar.com. We are so grateful for your generosity, whether tzedakah or truma. Thank you for keeping us in mind. So we say farewell for now. We will meet B'ezrat Hashem Motzei Shabbat after the Sabbath where we will gather for our ninth sitting, the ninth Torah portion, and the ninth way of acquiring Torah from the Mishnah, for the Torah portion of Vayishev. And I look forward to it. So thank you for entrusting me to provide this teaching.